Russia launches a massive air assault on Ukraine, targeting the capital of Kyiv with hundreds of drones and dozens of missiles. Hello, I'm Anton, and this is The Heat. Moscow promised it would retaliate against Kyiv after Ukraine pulled off a coordinated drone strike on Russian air bases. On Friday, Russia delivered with an overnight bombardment across Ukraine. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy says the strikes involved more than 400 drones and 40 missiles, and called on the United States and European allies to put pressure on Russia to end the fighting. For insight, we turn now to Michael O'Hanlon. He's the Chair in Defense and Strategy and Director of Research in the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. Michael, good to see you. Thanks for being with us.
My pleasure.
So this promised retaliation by Russia has taken place. As we reported, Russia launched a barrage of missiles and drones on the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv. There are casualties and widespread destruction. What is your assessment of this attack and counter-attack? And are we going to see much more of an escalation from the Russians?
Greetings. Well, you never know. And we do expect a Russian offensive. And we've heard reports this week in Washington from visiting Ukrainians that they believe Russia's war aims are still quite expansive and extend towards taking the entire Black Sea coast from Ukraine and possibly even taking the entire eastern half of the country, not just the 4 provinces that President Putin asked Russian parliament to annex along with Crimea a couple of years ago. And so if that's the case, I think Putin's more interested in the ground war than he is in direct retaliation per se. But of course, he was going to do something. And on balance, I still think you could argue the Ukrainians got the upper hand in the last week's exchange, given the importance of those bombers for Russia. But certainly Russia has a lot of things going for it on the battlefield more broadly. And so I don't really expect another direct escalation necessarily from last weekend's drone attacks on the Russian bomber bases, but I do expect relentless Russian fighting in the months to come.
Michael, do those Ukrainian attacks last Sunday change the battlefield scenario in any significant way?
I don't think so, in the sense that we saw already, as you just reported, what Russia could still do by way of striking Ukrainian cities yesterday, overnight, or I guess this morning. And moreover, the real fight is on the ground, and those bombers were not particularly crucial for that ground fight anyhow. So I think that on balance, it was impressive. It showed a certain vulnerability in Russia that they didn't necessarily appreciate that they had before, but I don't think it's a game changer.
The prevailing view, and we've heard this from analysts and scholars like Jeffrey Sachs from Columbia University, as well as John Mearsheimer at the University of Chicago, is that this conflict is over. Ukraine has lost, Russia has won. But would this display of Russian power force some kind of a reassessment of that?
Well, first of all, I strongly disagree with professors, whoever, I don't want to quote them because I didn't see those clips.
Yeah.
But anybody who would say the war is over, I would ask them first in a commonsensical way, what do you mean when there are still many hundreds of people being wounded each day in active fighting? Second, when Ukraine still controls 80% of its own original territory and its own government and sovereignty, how could you say that it's already lost? So that makes absolutely no sense to me whatsoever. But I do think we should ask, with a more serious perspective, how do we wrap this war up in a way that allows the world to move on? I know that, it's a terrible tragedy, but I think we also have to be pragmatic about how we stop it. And some of President Trump's ideas, therefore, I believe, are reasonable. Basically, freezing the ceasefire line along the current line of control or fighting, for example, would be a practical way to get to a peace process, even though it essentially rewards Russian aggression. But I think that we need to underscore this war could go on a lot longer. And the idea that somehow its outcome is predetermined is simply untrue.
And if we look at some of the thinking in the Kremlin, the Russian analyst Tatyana Stanovaya of the Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center, she's got a pretty good line to the Kremlin and is well informed on the thinking there. She wrote on X, and I'm going to quote her. She said, "I believe such attacks will only reinforce his," meaning Putin's, "determination to dismantle the Ukrainian state in its current form. He will respond by becoming more hardline and less compliant." Unquote. Do you agree with that assessment?
Well, I can't disagree, but to me, Putin already looked pretty hardened and pretty entrenched in his position before last weekend. So I think even though that is the big news of the week, and it makes sense for you and me and others to discuss the news of the week, I think it would be a mistake to believe that many things have changed in any way, shape, or form. Putin was already very committed to this war. He showed very little interest in a peace process or a ceasefire, even prior to last weekend, and that continues to be the case today. But his war aims were determined over a period of many years and even decades. They were not going to be easily influenced by one, however spectacular, event on the battlefield last week.
Right. Now, despite that Ukrainian attack, there was actually a round of peace talks which took place in Istanbul, actually happened the next day. Both sides presented memoranda setting out conditions for a ceasefire, but neither side is willing to accept the other's terms, although there is a prisoner swap which is scheduled for this weekend. Do you hold out much hope for a negotiated settlement in the short term, or could we see this go on for much, much longer?
Well, the simple fact of peace talks being convened tells you almost nothing. It's better than the absence of peace talks. But as you well know, for example, the Israelis and Palestinians have been talking for 30 years, and it didn't prevent October 7th, 2023, or what came next. And so I don't put a lot of stock, no, in these talks, and I do not see much prospect for any near-term resolution or agreement on a ceasefire.
As far as what the United States can do, I mean, President Trump has threatened more than once to walk away from any kind of negotiated settlement if there is no progress. I mean, what happens if he carries out that threat? Can Europe, for one, fill that vacuum that will be left there without the United States?
Well, I think it's a meaningless threat by President Trump because it provides the main impediment or obstacle to the peace talks, Vladimir Putin, with exactly what he would want, which is less American involvement and less American support. So President Trump is threatening the wrong side. And what he needs to do is find a way to threaten Vladimir Putin, either with tougher enforcement of existing sanctions, tougher sanctions and more comprehensive sanctions, seizure of Russian frozen assets in European banks, additional American economic and military assistance for Ukraine, and possibly even to, as I've written, to start speculating that while he doesn't really favor bringing Ukraine into NATO at the moment, if Russia shows no willingness to agree to a ceasefire anytime down the line, perhaps Trump would reconsider that approach, because Trump has wanted to hold out a bit of an olive branch to Vladimir Putin, and perhaps that's an okay idea as long as it's reciprocated. But if Putin doesn't show any interest in patching things up with President Trump, then perhaps the NATO card could be invoked. So I think all these things could be on the table. President Trump needs to think about how to put pressure on Putin, not how to reward Putin for his intransigence at the peace process.
Michael O'Hanlon, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Now, for more analysis on the Russia-Ukraine conflict, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Moscow is Andrey Kortunov. He served as the Director General and Academic Director of the Russian International Affairs Council from 2011 until 2024. Also with us in our Washington, D.C. studio is Anton Fedyashin. He's a professor of history at American University and a Russian and European affairs analyst. And from Kyiv, Peter Zalmayev is the Director of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative. Thanks, everyone, for being with us. Peter, let me start with you. You are in Kyiv right now. Russia said it would retaliate for the Ukrainian attacks last week. And overnight, there's been a barrage of missiles and drone attacks across Ukraine. It hit the capital as well. There are casualties. There is destruction. What can you tell us about the situation there now?
Yes, as expected, Vladimir Putin would retaliate, and he felt like he needed something spectacular. Just for this level of humiliation that his armed forces and his generals suffered with this unprecedented attack deep inside Russia's territory, which took out dozens of Russian planes, including nuclear equipped planes as well. That is a significant blow to Vladimir Putin. Ukraine did not experience anything that it hadn't experienced before. Yes, this was a significant attack, several people dead in Kyiv, but not anything that Ukrainians are unfortunately not used to by now. The thing is that Vladimir Putin is also under certain pressure to give some of his warmongering parties something to be satisfied about. And short of a nuclear weapon, which Putin has still not, been audacious enough to use, we were afraid that there may be another strike by Oreshnik, this very sophisticated ballistic missile that Russia had been developing recently, but it didn't come, which means that the arsenal of Oreshnik may be limited, or maybe there isn't one available. So, we can expect another attack, and we're being told that another attack is coming soon. And now let me just sum up and say that in all of this, as a Ukrainian American, what's most disheartening for me is Donald Trump's, refusal to press Vladimir Putin about this, or to at least urge him to not, attack Ukraine, or to come to some kind of a resolution. It didn't come. And so it seems like Donald Trump is sort of a party to what happened last night in Kyiv and other Ukrainian cities.
Andrey Kortunov, looking at that initial attack by Ukraine, are there any questions being raised in Moscow right now on how the country's strategic fleet could be left so vulnerable to this kind of attack?
Well, it is right. Many experts raise concerns about the safety of the Russian strategic fleet. It's the first time that Ukraine was able to reach out to very remote parts of the Russian Federation, including Siberia and even the Far East. Of course, the strategic fleet is not directly involved in the Russian special military operation, but it's an important component of the Russian strategic deterrence. So it is a serious question for Russia. But on top of that, there are concerns about the so-called railroad war, which Ukraine apparently has launched against Russia in the neighboring regions of the Russian Federation. And the perception here in Moscow is that Ukraine targets not just military targets, but also civilian trains. This is, of course, another matter of concern for the Russian leadership.
Andrey, President Trump talked with President Putin by telephone. That was just a few days ago. It was a lengthy exchange. It was 90 minutes long. This was the fourth telephone call between the two leaders and came after delegations from Moscow and Kyiv met in Istanbul. We were talking about that a moment ago. How is that phone call being viewed in Moscow?
Well, the way how this call was reported here in Moscow suggests that Donald Trump understands the position of President Putin, that Putin has to retaliate, and that Trump is not likely to impose rigid economic sanctions based on this retaliation. Of course, this is the Russian interpretation of the call, and of course, with Trump, you can never be sure about what he's up to. His patience might be running thin, and he might somehow decrease his engagement in the peace effort that he has been involved until recently.
If we look at that Ukrainian attack, it was pretty spectacular, pretty audacious when you hit strategic bombers like they did in Russia. But does it in any way change the balance of power on the battlefield? Does it change that battlefield scenario in any way?
It will have no effect on the battlefield scenario that is beneficial to Ukraine. And unfortunately for the Ukrainians, it will probably have the opposite effect, because the Russians will simply redouble their efforts of essentially moving their army into Ukraine at the pace of a lava flow. But as we all know, lava flows are maybe slow, but they are impossible to stop. And that's basically what's been going on over the past 2 years. So unfortunately for the Ukrainians, strategically, this strike, as spectacular as it was operationally and as embarrassing it was for the Russians, may have the opposite effect of the one intended.
Were you surprised in any way that those talks that took place in Istanbul a day after this Ukrainian attack actually went ahead? They did take place.
No, because the Russians have been fairly clear about the fact that they expect the talks to continue. It's just that they expect the settlement, whatever shape it will take, to be on their conditions. They will be setting the conditions. Again, unfortunately for the Ukrainians, neither they nor their European allies, nor even the Trump administration are in any position right now, given the balance of power on the ground, to dictate conditions to Moscow. Quite the contrary. So we'll see how this turns out, but the Russian advance will continue, and it's happening along the entire length of the front line.
Just one final question, Anton, before I move on, and that is, do you expect there to be a further and bigger escalation from Russia?
Quite possible. Maybe tonight, maybe the day after. That is entirely up to the Kremlin, and it will be Putin who makes the ultimate decision.
Okay. Peter Zalmayev, President Trump said it would be better for Ukraine and Russia to continue to fight each other for a while longer. Let's listen to what he said.
Sometimes you're better off letting them fight for a while and then pulling them apart. And I gave that analogy to Putin yesterday. I said, President, maybe you're going to have to keep fighting and suffering a lot, because both sides are suffering, before you pull them apart, before they're able to be pulled apart.
So, Peter, what do you make of the comments that the president made there? And do you still see a significant role for the United States in resolving this?
Of course, there's a significant role, and America and Donald Trump knows very well that were he to just walk away from Ukraine, and we're not talking about just provision of weaponry and air defense systems such as Patriots, but just basically if U.S. decided to cut off its intelligence sharing with Ukraine, that would deal a decisive blow to our ability to resist. So regarding his rhetoric and his comparison of the two kids fighting and the need to just fight it out, I'm with the German Chancellor, who actually took issue with it in a very diplomatic way, obviously not to antagonize the very thin-skinned American president, but this is completely inappropriate to draw any sort of equal sign between the aggressor and the victim. Aggressor that obviously, I mean, if you're talking about children, this would be equivalent of comparing the fight of a 5-year-old brother with his 15-year-old brother, right? This is an uneven fight, and another boy is looking at it and just like, let them fight it out. You know, this is very unfair. And once again, it brings a lot of concerns, you know, about whose side Donald Trump is on. I thought last time I checked that America is Ukraine's ally and vice versa. America is a crucial component and member of the Ramstein coalition. But the way Donald Trump has been acting makes me feel like it's Vladimir Putin whose heart he is pursuing and who he wants to be friends with, rather than with Ukraine.
Andrei, I cited the comment from the Russian analyst Tatiana Stanovaya earlier on when I was talking to Michael O'Hanlon, and she says that she believes that Russia will be less inclined to negotiate peace, and this will strengthen Putin's resolve to, in her words, dismantle Ukraine. Do you agree with that?
Well, I don't think that any of us really knows what President Putin thinks and what his red lines are. I think the choice that he has is very clear. It's not about specific territories that he would like to control. It's about the level of the Ukrainian sovereignty that he's ready to tolerate. And that remains an open question, because on the one hand, there are many people here in Moscow who argue that Ukraine has to relaunch its state project, and this is what they call denazification. But others believe that a compromise can be reached through diplomatic means. And of course, depending on how you approach this issue, you might come up with very different models of the ultimate settlement.
Anton, how does Russia ensure that its security is guaranteed insofar as a resolution with Ukraine is concerned?
There are two avenues. One of them is going to be the diplomatic talks, where the Russians are in a position right now to impose their terms on the Ukrainians. And the other one is to let the talks languish and to simply continue to do what it's doing and win militarily on the field. And all indications are that the Russians are in the middle of a summer offensive, which they are simply proceeding with slowly and gradually and very consistently. No big arrow offensive, but that a constant pressure along every single point of the front line. And the Ukrainian army simply doesn't have the manpower or the material to hold them back. So those are the two options that the Ukrainians are facing. So it's a question of which one the Ukrainian government is going to choose.
Yeah, I want to get Peter's response to that. But first, Anton, what does a military victory look like?
Well, the military victory in the Russian calculation right now looks like the collapse of the Ukrainian army and the potential advance of the Russian army all the way to the Dnieper, however long that may take. But that opens a whole other set of questions about the efficiency of the control over that territory and all sorts of other issues, including, by the way, territorial control. There's also the question of a buffer zone in the north of Ukraine, which Russians have already started setting up. They're slowly moving towards the regional capital of Sumy, having reversed the Ukrainian gains in Kursk. So there are many different variations this may take, but all of them look pretty bleak for Ukraine.
Peter, what's your response to that?
We've been hearing about this, including from the previous speaker, Anton, ever since we've started doing these panels together, and I've probably done at least 10 with him. And we always hear that, you know, the Ukraine is on the back footing and it's really going to be tough, and Russia is about to destroy the army, etc. It's been now 3 years and 4 months, and we're still here. Don't forget that Putin went into Ukraine expecting it to fall within 3 to 7 days, and we are still here. Don't also forget, when we're talking about this being a war of attrition and the depleting resources. Yes, Russia obviously has supremacy in all of that. But at the same time, according to military intelligences, Western military intelligences, Russia has already lost 1 million men wounded and dead. The rhetorical question I would pose is, how many more of these can Russia afford to lose? They're really banking, they've taken their whole future to the pawn shop just because of Vladimir Putin's obsession. And let me just say one more thing. What we're seeing right now, after Donald Trump's misguided, but I think, somehow welcome peace initiative at the end of the day, is that Russia's initial, argument for going into this war has been proven completely, bunk and completely fake. And I think Donald Trump, to his credit, showed Russia up for this fakeness. Russia said that they went to Ukraine to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO. Well, Trump is actually willing to give them a no to NATO for Ukraine and other things, other duties. And what is Putin doing? Why is he not rushing to conclude that peace with no to Ukraine's membership in NATO? Because that was not the original reason. And this has been proven. His original reason, and it stands, is to control all of Ukraine, to restore Russia's greatness by conquering Ukraine and restoring the Soviet Union in one shape or form.
I know you want to respond very quickly.
Well, very quickly on the NATO issue. The Russians have already been on the receiving end of promises of no NATO expansion, no NATO membership. I think that the final decision will be made in Moscow about NATO once there is a signed document about Ukrainian neutrality, in addition to a whole bunch of other conditions. Yeah. But all of this could have been solved back in Istanbul in April of 2022. And unfortunately, under American and British pressure, the Ukrainians walked away from that negotiation.
In Washington, President Trump has asked the United States Senate to delay a vote on further sanctions against Russia. Now, this bill was sponsored by 2 senators, Senator Lindsey Graham as well as Senator Richard Blumenthal, and they call for a 500% tariff on countries that import Russian oil and raw materials. I mean, it's a bit confusing because the United States itself imports uranium from Russia. But would these types of sanctions or increased sanctions make any difference in Russia?
Well, the question is whether these sanctions can be implemented in practice, because that means that the United States should stop trading with countries like China or India, that have a lot of economic cooperation with Moscow, or that means that China should stop completely trading with Russia. And right now, the turnout between Russia and China is almost $250 billion. So it is not easy to implement. But I think that Donald Trump is concerned that if he supports the motion on the Capitol Hill, it will make Putin even less willing to go for any political compromise. So Donald Trump, I think, understandably, would like to explore other options, including assistance in the diplomatic negotiations between the two sides in the conflict.
Peter, as far as negotiations are concerned, let's look at what's on the table right now, because we were talking about those memoranda that both Russia and Ukraine took to the negotiations in Istanbul. But as far as the Ukrainians are concerned, they want a 30-day ceasefire, a full exchange of prisoners, and the return of Ukrainian children that were taken to Russia. But nothing is mentioned about Kyiv's position on territory that's been captured by Russia, and that, of course, includes Crimea.
Yes, Ukrainian law has to be changed for the negotiating side, for the Ukrainian side to be openly discussing whether some of these occupied territories will eventually be recognized de facto or de jure as Russia's territory, whether Crimea will be a separate issue, the Donbass will be a separate issue, knowing full well that this is against the Ukrainian law. But even if that were to happen, Ukraine is very wary of setting this precedent, obviously, because the Russian negotiating side has shown that they're not willing to be satisfied with the 20% they're currently occupying. They have actually put forward other and quite unacceptable demands to the Ukrainian side, that they retreat from the rest of these 4 oblasts that Russia is partially occupying. That would mean ceding 10 to 15% more of Ukrainian territory, and even Donald Trump and his team are not yet willing to pressure Ukraine into doing that. So that is just where we are. We have not been presented with any sort of acceptable demands that would not mean anything other than Ukraine's capitulation.
All right, Andrey, what kind of reasonable compromise could one accept from Russia on territory?
I wish I knew. I think that at this level that we had in Istanbul, it is practically impossible to discuss any serious compromises. The two sides only expressed their positions. They followed the official line. They exchanged documents, and that was about all. They can agree on prisoners exchange. They can agree on other minor issues, mostly technical issues. Maybe we will have another cycle of these negotiations, but as long as we have negotiations at this level, it is hard to imagine that either side will be ready and will be authorized to make more concessions.
Anton, very quickly, just got a minute left. European countries are increasingly optimistic that they can support Ukraine financially and militarily against Russia, even if Donald Trump says, I'm walking away from this, I've had enough, there's been no progress, we're not going to be involved in it. I mean, the Europeans at one time were even talking about assembling a coalition of the willing. But still, Europe can't match the United States in terms of the intelligence that it supplies to Ukraine, or the military assistance it gives Ukraine. This commitment by the Europeans, what do you make of it?
It's meaningless, the same way that all of the bilateral commitments that Ukraine signed with the Europeans, including that famous 100-year deal with the British. This is all fantasy. Even if the Europeans, even if the Americans continue to supply the Ukrainians with intelligence, intelligence by itself is pointless without the weapons that you can use to make benefit of it. Yeah. So without the United States, there's very little that Europeans are going to be able to do. So the faster the actual talks begin, even though the positions are very far apart, the better it is for everyone involved.
Okay, and that is where we are going to have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. And that is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington.